Yeah, I'm gonna grab a tissue.
Lonnie, you gonna MO?
Yeah.
Nope.
Okay. So here's the construct. So in 1984, Colombian drug lord Pablo Escobar was hiding in Panama on the run from Colombian authorities, who had signed a treaty with the United States agreeing to extradite Escobar and other high-level drug traffickers in exchange for amnesty. Escobar offered a three-pronged deal. He would, one, repatriate all of his capital from overseas bank accounts back to Colombia. Two, he would pay off the entirety of the Colombian national debt, which was estimated at around 13 billion, and three, leave the drug trade. In reality, the Colombian government did not take the deal. This House believes that it would have been preferable to the status quo for the Colombian government to agree to the first two tenets of Escobar's plan, so to have him repatriate his capital to Colombia and pay off the national debt. Instead of the third tenet, however, we're going to say that the Colombian government should have given Escobar and his Medellin drug cartel exclusive rights over the Colombian cocaine trade.
Right, much to Amelia's annoyance, I have still not watched Narcos.
Oh, you should.
What the fuck, dude?
But I will. All right, cool. 1984, Colombia. What is the United States and Reagan's role in Colombia or lack thereof right now?
So the United States is anti-drug, but their like main focus during this time period is communism, very anti-communist. There's been some involvement in Colombia, but they really haven't helped Colombia enough for Colombia to have any meaningful hope of the drug trade.
They really haven't what, sorry?
Helped Colombia enough to give Colombia any meaningful shot at fighting off the drug trade.
Any meaningful shot? Okay. Cool.
The U.S. doesn't support taking this deal, right?
No.
Does the U.S. have relations with Colombia outside of like the drug trade?
Yeah, I mean, like there's like trade, there's presumably some flow of people back and forth, there's diplomatic ties.
So the actor is Colombia. The case is offer this deal. Will Pablo Escobar accept it? Like, will this happen?
Yeah. We'll caveat that he'll accept it.
Okay. Well, accept. Cool. That will happen. It's my understanding that Pablo Escobar has used like a fair amount of money to like help with social services and stuff. Like he's a popular figure in some respects, isn't he?
Oh, yeah. So, this is important. I actually forgot to mention something. So, there's the government in Colombia, right? And then there's an anti-government group called the FARC.
Yeah.
The FARC is a communist group, fighting against the government to establish communism in Colombia. Pablo Escobar, not really affiliated with FARC, not really affiliated with the Colombian government, obviously, but very beloved by the people who've been providing all these social services.
But he has what? Sorry, he has been providing.
He's been building houses. He's been building schools. He's very popular. He was at one point elected to the Colombian parliament, and had to step down because he's a drug lord. But was elected in the last.
Cool. So where are we in 1984? Is Pablo Escobar like full on badass? Is he everything?
I'm sorry.
Where are we in the life of Pablo Escobar in 1984?
They're pretty deeply enmeshed in the drug trade. He's been killing lots of people. He has 13 billion. He has more than 13 billion dollars. He, has pretty consistent control over the Colombian drug trade, shipping lots and lots of drugs. What else do you want to know?
So he has $13 billion. He's bringing it back. So he will pay off the entirety of the debt. Is that just?
He will pay off the entirety of the debt, and like we'll have money left over.
He'll what?
He will pay off the entirety of the debt, and we'll have money left over. Like this is a man with lots of money.
Word. Wait, he's just giving you everything. He's not keeping money.
Oh no. He will have plenty of money left over after he pays off the Colombian national debt.
So the Colombian national debt is significantly less than 13 billion.
Okay, I'm sorry. So the Colombian national debt is $13 billion.
Would
Pablo Escobar can pay that off, and he will still have plenty of money in his own his own bank account. Like I don't know how much money he has. Like imagine he had like $20 billion, right? Like if he pays off 13 billion, he still has 7 billion.
so where is what is Pablo Escobar doing this second?
He's in Panama.
He's where?
He's in Panama.
Is he just like chilling, or is he doing stuff in Panama too?
Yeah, he's basically just chilling. So like the United States signed this extradition treaty with the United States. Pablo Escobar like doesn't want to get extradited, so he's fled to Panama. And he's still running all of his drug operations in Colombia just from Panama. And like in response to this extradition treaty that Colombia signed with the United States, he's like been waging war against the government and assassinating lots of politicians and things like that.
How does giving him the full right? So how does giving him a monopoly of the cocaine deal work? Do you just agree to not arrest anyone associated with Escobar and arrest everyone else who is not, or?
We're going to say that the government isn't going to take like an enforcement role in that. The government is just not going to go after him for drug-related activities. So obviously, like if his associates murder somebody, then the government might or might not like choose to investigate that, but they're not going to like try to crack down on his drug smuggling.
Are there a lot of problems being caused by Colombia's debt right now?
It's a heavy debt. It's kind of just like any country. When the more debt you have, the higher cost of borrowing. The harder it is to bring new capital into your country. It's not Greece, but it's not great.
Has Pablo Escobar? So you caveated that he would take this deal. Has he given any indication as to whether or not he would take a deal that involves him leaving the drug trade?
That he would take a deal with him leaving the drug trade? Yeah, he was the one that offered that deal.
So there's a three-pronged deal, and you guys are saying offer the first two prongs and caveat that he'll take it.
Yes.
Is there any indication as to whether or not he would take this three-pronged deal, or is that just not?
So he was the one that proposed the original deal with him leaving the drug trade.
Okay. So he does that. He wants that. Okay.
Yeah, I can reread the case contract if you want.
Sure.
Okay, so in 1984, Colombian drug lord Pablo Escobar was hiding in Panama on the run from the Colombian authorities, who had signed a treaty with the United States agreeing to extradite Escobar and other high-level drug traffickers. In exchange for amnesty, Escobar, so he's offering the Colombian government a three-pronged deal. He would, one, repatriate all of his capital from overseas bank accounts back to Colombia. So, like, say he has, $13 billion in a Swiss bank account, he's moving that back to Colombian banks. Two, he would pay off the $13 billion Colombian national debt. And three, this is the third part of the deal that he's offering Colombia, he will leave the drug trade. This is the deal that he offered them. In reality, the Colombian government didn't take the deal. So status quo is no deal, none of those things happen. Case is, it would be preferable to the status quo for the Colombian government to agree to the first two tenets of his plan. So to have him repatriate his capital to Colombia and pay off the national debt. But the Colombian government is also going to offer Pablo Escobar, and we're caveating that he will accept this deal, exclusive rights over the Colombian cocaine trade.
So are we defending no deal at all, or can we defend the full deal?
So it's preferable to the status quo. So you're defending no deal. Like we have response. Like there are things in case for why we think it's preferable for him to have control over the drug trade versus no one else. So you can take that advocacy if you want.
Is this from the perspective of like the Colombian government, or would it just be like normatively better?
Yeah, this is from the perspective of the Colombian government.
All right, Lonnie, do you have any other questions?
Nope, I'm good.
Okay.
You guys ready?
Yep.
Alright. So the first thing we want to talk about is about how ending the drug war is key to saving Colombia from anarchy. First, we'll tell you that the drug war cannot be won. Even with Escobar and his cronies in Panama, their operations in Colombia have continued because the country is the best place in the world to go coca. The drug trade in Colombia, whether or not Escobar is at the head, will never stop. If Colombia's government doesn't take Escobar up on the deal, it has to keep fighting against an enemy with infinitely more resources than Colombia has. Additionally, every dollar that Colombia spends fighting the drug war, Escobar can match double. The government is faced with the option of either spending more money on the war, which trades off with social services and basic welfare, or fighting a mitigatory fight that only leads to the loss of more lives on both sides with no benefit. Taking out Escobar only means that someone else will rise in his stead. The drug trade is too profitable for the risks associated with it to be a meaningful deterrent. The only person who has been successfully able to drive other drug traffickers out of business is Escobar himself. So even if you're able to kill Pablo Escobar, one of his henchmen is going to rise in his stead. Even if you manage to convince him to leave the drug trade, you'll just say that some other cartel will rise in his place. Side opposition has to prove to you why Colombia should be fighting the drug war in the first place. We don't think there's a substantial difference between cocaine and anything else just as harmful, like handguns, that corporations are legally allowed to produce. But second under this point, we'll tell you that the drug trade is tearing the country apart. First, trying to prosecute the traffickers is destroying any remaining legitimacy of the Colombian government. Any honest judges, politicians, or police officers that try to enforce the law against the drug traffickers are given three choices by the narcos: death, corruption, or early retirement. Not only does this mean that the narcos aren't being prosecuted and that lives are being lost, but it means that no other criminals are being prosecuted either because there's not a functioning legal system. This means that the ability of the government to provide for Colombia is just being erased. But if Escobar's trafficking is legalized, honest government agents can return to their jobs, facing no severe threats for enforcing the law, and will be able to take out murderers and rapists and criminals, the ones they're not able to take out now. When you stop fighting the narcos, they stop fighting back, and Colombia can have peace. But third under this point, we'll tell you that the drug war is being fought for American lives. Colombians are too poor to buy the cocaine that Escobar is producing. The majority of it is being bought by partiers in Miami. Given that the governments have a fundamental obligation, first and foremost, to their own people, because those people are the ones that gave up their rights specifically to that government under the social contract, and because those people are the ones paying the taxes that make the government exist in the first place, we say opt for the solution that saves Colombian lives. But fourth, we would tell you that Escobar's monopoly is better than the alternative. If Colombia manages to incapacitate the Medellin cartel, many more will rise in its stead and fight both the government and each other for control, causing an even greater loss of life. Escobar has managed to take out all of the other cartels. If Colombia stops fighting him, there will be peace. The last under this point, we would tell you that the only way to actually win the drug war is to invite U.S. DEA agents into your country, which signals to your people that you've lost political legitimacy. Then, any rational person would turn to the protection of the narcos, the second strongest group in the country, if the government loses legitimacy. Plus, we would tell you that U.S. intervention is bad for the country. The troops will only care about ending the cocaine trade, not Colombian stability, which is a tactic that will destroy the country more, alienate the population, and push them towards the FARC guerrillas, which would only entrench U.S. involvement because the U.S. cares first and foremost about anti-communist efforts. So our second main point is that Escobar's drug monopoly would be good for the Colombian economy. First, under this, we want to talk about the national debt. It's pretty clear that if Colombia has the opportunity to pay off the entirety of its national debt, it should take the deal. The lower a country's national debt, the higher the country's credit assessment, which increases Colombia's ability to borrow more at lower rates. This means that it's easier to bring capital into your country, which sparks development and economic growth, and is especially important for a developing country. But additionally, under this point, we would tell you that repatriation of capital strengthens Colombia. Colombians are making millions of dollars off of the drug trade each day, but because the drug lords are being forced to hide their money in foreign bank accounts, the country can't benefit from the money. When Escobar and his cronies bring their capital back to Colombia, there's a ton of money to stimulate growth, money in the banks to do investment banking and things like that, and money just to spend on things in the country that can be used to hire gardeners, construction workers, accountants, all the things that you need to run a drug empire and build from the wealth, which means lots more jobs for your countrymen. And we would tell you that this money is taxable. If you tax the drug lords at any reasonable percentage, you'll literally have billions more in the national treasury. Regardless of direct economic benefits, the narcos have a history of charity in the country, which can often be more effective than government aid. But last, under this point, we would tell you that as a monopoly, the Medellin cartel has complete control over the price of cocaine and an incentive to push the price up as high as possible. This means a continuation of the status quo, where cocaine is only available for rich Americans and kept out of the hands of Colombians who only reap the benefits and none of the harms of the drug trade. The alternative, a bunch of different drug organizations, introduces cross-dressers to lower prices, making cocaine addiction epidemics infinitely more likely in Colombia. But last, we want to talk to you about Colombian political stability. We tell you that Colombia's government is pursuing a losing strategy, which is a recipe for losing political control. Cracking down on the drug trade has caused a level of chaos in the country that is pushing the people to seek protection under both the drug lords and the FARC, the communist guerrilla group that is challenging the government for power. The popular outrage against the government for not taking the deal could be enough to topple it. The people love Pablo Escobar for his charity and his Robin Hood image. They'll see the government as needlessly prolonging the conflict, especially because the government is already seen as the pawn of the United States, which is driving up FARC support. If you stop the drug war, you send a message that you're not cowing to American influence anymore, which is powerful enough for South American empowerment and for keeping your own power. But lastly, we would tell you that there's no international consequences for ending the drug war. The United States may be angry about the fact that you're no longer cracking down on Pablo Escobar, but they're not going to do anything about it. Recognize that this case is set 13 years after the OPEC oil embargo, and Colombia is a major South American oil-producing country. No matter how much the United States hates the drug trade, it's not going to risk alienating one of the major oil-producing non-OPEC countries. The alternative to the current government is the FARC communist guerrillas, which the United States wants to keep from gaining power at all costs. The United States sure won't be happy, but it's going to grit its teeth and maybe even try to push investment in other areas of Colombia's economy to drive out the drug trade, which would only stimulate further economic investment in Colombia. We think that sure, this is a controversial solution, but we think it's one that's very clearly best for Colombia. And for all those reasons, I'm very happy to propose this case.
The terminal flaw in the government's case is a misunderstanding about the way drug epidemics are actually working in the 1980s. It is true that in the United States, most of the people that are buying drugs are in the United States. But what is not true is that they are simply doing a cost-benefit analysis and choosing when to buy drugs based on how expensive it is, because that's not how addiction works. It is a physiological condition that compels you to do drugs, whatever the cost. Meaning all the points Geneva gives you about how monopoly is good because it drives the prices up into only the hands of the wealthy simply fall through. When you have a crack epidemic in the United States and people are addicted and they're sacrificing their children and their homes and their food in order to get drugs and committing crime to do so, we simply do not believe that a higher price will ultimately stop people from buying the drugs. The first independent point I want to advance to you is why monopoly is actually bad. Because we think when price gouging does happen, when you do create a monopoly, the ultimate makes it so that one person can charge whatever they want for cocaine. You think people are still going to use it in the United States. They're still going to commit crimes to get there. They're still going to be in poverty. They're still going to want to get the drugs and ultimately have negative externalities in order to feed their addiction. When this happens, you have all the same problems in the United States being upset about a cocaine problem, but it's exponentially worse because now they have to commit more negative externalities in order to get the same drugs that they're addicted to, because Geneva just happened to make them more expensive by literally giving a monopoly to one drug cartel. This means there is more crime. This means the United States is more upset, meaning that they have just a greater incentive to send the DEA, the greater incentive to make sure that they interfere in the Colombian world, and a greater incentive to make sure that they ultimately get the reparations that they think is important for the United States. So that is why monopoly is bad in a kind of external sense and the impact that it has in the United States that then has an impact on you. But secondly, why do we think a drug monopoly is bad within Colombia internally? Because we don't think it's simply the case that when one person has all the money and all the drugs and all the guns or whatever, that it's simply the case that everything's going to be fine. Because even if you buy that it brings more peace to the drug market specifically, we think that that incredible power that you have over guns makes it much more likely that they have the ability to do everything else in the country, not just the monopoly over the drugs themselves. So recognize when you create a little paramilitary force that has all the power and all the money from the drug cartels specifically and say that they're able to do whatever we want, we think that gives all the people that are underneath them, not Pablo Escobar themselves, full range to commit other crimes. Now, Geneva tried to like caveat this out in POCs by saying we won't arrest them for murder and everything else, but the problem is that that happens when it's too late. Because one of the ways you stop murder, one of the ways you stop other crime is when you see someone going to buy drugs or going to sell drugs or going to commit drugs, you can stop them for doing that. But if they're committing murder or whatever in order to get a whole bunch of drugs or trying to stop a boat in order to get a drug shipment or whatever, at that point it may be too late. They already have an incentive to do that because they feel that they have immunity for the drugs themselves. Meaning that it's bad for a monopoly because more U.S. people use it, and it's bad internally because of all the other power that they have when they ultimately have control of drugs leads them to be able to commit other crime as well. Second independent point is why we think they actually have more violence on their side of the house. More side of violence on their side of the house. Because I think the argument they're trying to advance is when you have just one cartel that is in charge, you're going to have a lot of peace because everyone else is no longer going to want a portion of the drug trade. This is simply not the case. The reason why different gangs and different countries and even different prison gangs ultimately find peace in the world is when you have competing factions that ultimately have to sign for peace because they realize that the violence between them would be so catastrophic. What happens when you have one drug cartel and ultimately in charge of a country? There are still people who want a piece of that money and want a piece of the drugs, and now they have an incentive to ultimately commit violence in order to get that. So it's not the case that because Pablo Escobar is in charge, no one else is going to want cocaine money anymore. It is simply the case that they no longer have as much of an incentive to sue for peace or whatever, amongst other cartels. They have every incentive to use violence in order to actually get into that group. I mean, you do still have violence, whether it's Pablo Escobar cracking down or the government cracking down on others. I mean, you still have the violence of people committing crimes against each other. You still have the violence of the government ultimately having to going out and stop these people. You still have the violence bleeding out into the streets and the family, which we think is bad. But a third independent point is why we don't think that you should actually allow Pablo Escobar to solve all the social problems in your country. Because first off, we think that his social services presumably do not benefit the country as a whole. Recognize what we think he is doing is probably either A, only pandering to people that we think ultimately would provide him some kind of base of support, or B, we think that the social services probably do not help people who would actually be a threat to him, right? So if it is true that he wants to have a monopoly over all the prices and all the services within the country, we think it is very unlikely that he would then use social services and ultimately to benefit, say, a business sector, a manufacturing sector somewhere else in the country, even if he is helping services specifically for the poor. What we think this means is that you create a cult of personality around this person, which ultimately makes it harder to do any other economic reforms because you don't want to ultimately hurt him. We think this is bad because it undermines. We think this is bad because it makes it harder to stimulate any other area of your economy, which we think is good. We also think that even if he is successful in providing social services to everyone, then it simply just undermines faith in the government because they no longer seem to be able to provide it for themselves. So recognize that this is a short-term, long-term cost-benefit analysis here. What Geneva is saying that is in the short term, these people love Pablo Escobar and he's able to provide a lot of social services and they'll be upset at you. But the reason why they love Pablo Escobar is because they believe the government cannot provide the services themselves. If you're able to turn that narrative around and start providing social services yourself, then they won't look to Pablo Escobar and ultimately to provide them. That these are long-term structural problems you need to solve. Simply having him in here paying off the debt once and then providing social services does not actually restore faith to the government. It simply makes it seem like the government has failed once again and this person needs to ultimately provide the services for them. So we don't think that's good even if it counts as the anti-U.S. narrative. First point on case is that it's ultimately going to end the drug war, and that's going to be good because resources and money is spent on the drug war is a trade-off on welfare. First off, we don't think this is true. We think that if there are cartels and they're able to sue for peace, whatever, that ultimately means you have to spend less money in the drug war. We think when you have Pablo Escobar ultimately in charge and you still have other people that don't have like the sophistication in order to sue for peace or divide up territory, but instead to fight over the same territory, it's going to be bad. I think the reason why gangs in New York or whatever ultimately did not bleed into violence on the streets is because they divvied up territory and decided to have relative peace between them. When you have Pablo Escobar controlling a whole bunch of territory and you still have other people that want the money, they have an incentive to attack and create criminal acts at every area of the country. I think actually leads to more violence, leads to more resources and money spent on the drug war. So other criminals are not going to be prosecuted. We think that you actually need to make sure that other criminals are not going to be prosecuted because you're focusing on drug war. We think that if we prove that you're spending more money in drug war in their world, that means you actually have even less criminals going to be prosecuted. We say that Americans are buying, you have no obligation to help them. If you actually increase the price on Americans that are being addicted, then the Americans will just have a great incentive to ultimately interfere in your country. I mean, you do have some obligations to make sure that they don't help. You do have some obligations to make sure these people aren't dying. Otherwise, it's just incentivizing Americans to interfere. They say all other They said that the U.S. will come to stop the drugs. We think they actually increase that on their side of the house. Second independent point about why a monopoly is good. They say less debt actually makes it ultimately makes it easier to borrow. We think if they increase the drug one on their side of the house, they spend more money, which ultimately leads to more debt. We think that if we provide social services on our side of the house, it increases the faith in the government, meaning people will turn to the government, meaning they'll be more likely to pay for taxes for social services instead of just turning to Escobar to do it. They're more likely to pay taxes. We get the tax money they paid on the debt that actually leads to democracy. The reason why the developing world often fails is because the people that are paying taxes don't feel like they're getting social services in return, so ultimately fail to pay taxes, turning to external forces to get it. If we create a government that ultimately paying social services, we get taxes, and that's fine. Even if in the short term that ultimately increases debt, that's fine. We're saying that it's fine if people have to pay more money to borrow and start up businesses. If in the long term it increases faith in the government because they just take out more money to provide for social services, I think that's fine. The idea that the price is going to go up, meaning only rich people are going to be addicted, is ridiculous. People already are addicted. The price going up won't ultimately stop them. Then they say there's going to be outrage over not taking a deal because you look like a U.S. pawn. Again, we think the outrage is because you haven't been providing social services. If you simply just say we'll increase debt for a short period of time and ultimately provide social services, then it's going to be fine as well. Ultimately, people will look at you fine, not look at you as a U.S. pawn. Third independent point, though, I think is the final thing they say, though, I actually want to collapse because I don't have much time here. This entire idea about outrage over not taking the deal because you'll look like a U.S. pawn is ridiculous. The reason why that is true is that if you ultimately provide social services, then the people will look upon the government favorably, meaning they won't need to say that you are in opposition to the United States all the time. You won't have to have the same kind of rally around the flag effect where people are blaming the U.S. for your ultimate problems. They actually look internally, find out what the problems are, and they see that you are providing social services, return to the government for answers instead of the cartel. That's how you get any kind of long-term services for debt, crime, everything else. Perfect.
Ready? Okay, cool. All right, so the first thing we hear is, hang on. Okay, we're good. Okay, cool. So the first thing we hear is that this construct that, like, so drugs actually function differently, right? Because people get addicted, and addiction is bad, and that's what's actually going to cause people in Colombia to actually start doing drugs, and this is really, really bad, right? Because all the reasons that drugs are bad, right? But recognize that the reason why people aren't doing drugs in the status quo is because, like, okay, so sure, addiction is a thing, right? But people aren't doing them because of the high price of entry into the market that exists because of the, like, the pricey nature of cocaine, right? Like, given the fact that Pablo Escobar can sell his drugs at a very, very high price in Miami, and in this situation, he won't be stopped by any Colombian authorities. Like, obviously, it is just in his interest to sell them at that higher price, right? Like, sure, there probably are some people in Colombia who have the money to buy this and get addicted to it. But realistically, the average person isn't going to be like, you know what I'm going to do? I've never done cocaine before, but I'm going to spend literally all of my money to feed my family on trying cocaine. That sounds like a good idea. I don't think anyone is feasibly going to do that. And just look at the status quo. People aren't doing that now. So I don't see a reason why people are going to start doing that in the future. There is still going to be a high cost of cocaine. People are not going to start doing this, right? Like, having a monopoly means that the price goes up, not down. If people aren't getting addicted in the status quo, they won't be doing it in the future, right? Cool. The next thing we hear about is how so the underlings of Pablo Escobar are going to, like, get involved in other crimes, right? Because, like, now if the government's not prosecuting them, then, like, they can do whatever they want, right? But recognize that, like, Pablo Escobar wants to be popular, right? Like, if all of a sudden, like, Pablo Escobar's thugs start terrorizing the countryside and killing lots and lots of people, people are going to say, hey, wait a second, this Pablo Escobar guy, he's not so good after all. Maybe we shouldn't be giving him a monopoly in the end, right? So then there'll be pressure on the government to end the monopoly in favor of Pablo Escobar. Pablo Escobar really just wants to make money, right? So having his underlings running around terrorizing the country is just not in his interest if he can just peacefully operate, right? Like, Pablo Escobar, like, in the status quo, the reason why Pablo Escobar is killing people is as a means to an end to accomplish his business. He just wants to make money. If he doesn't have to kill people, he just won't, right? And recognize that the alternative to this is just Pablo Escobar continuing to kill people, but you can't actually do anything about it because all of the judges that you would have that would be enforcing laws and actually arresting these murderers are now, like, hiding for their lives or are just dead, right? So realistically, the alternative is just not enforcing the law whatsoever. So we think that enforcing law in some capacity is probably just better than that, right? Second thing we hear about is how this weird argument about how peace only occurs when like buying drug cartels like sign treaties with each other because mutually assured destruction or something like that, right? But realistically, what happens is when there are these people who are like, I want to get involved in the drug trade, because Pablo Escobar is so powerful, they're probably not going to try and start their own rival operation because they're just going to lose to Pablo Escobar because he can just outproduce them and just outcompete them. So they won't actually be successful. Anyone who's interested in getting involved within the drug trade, their only option is to join Pablo Escobar and become a part of his operation, right? Like once you have like a very, very large business, it just goes bigger, right? Anyone who tries to enter the market just fails to compete and they just lose, right? So I don't think you're realistically going to see any new drug operations coming into the situation. Recognize that like there were a lot of drug operations in Colombia before, but Pablo Escobar like consolidated them and put them all together into his empire, right? Like the fact that he's been able to do this in the past suggests that even if there were to be new like drug cartels, whatever, in the future, that he would probably be able to consolidate those two because of his own business acumen and skill at hustling people, whatever, right? Last thing you hear about is how like, look, don't let Pablo Escobar solve all your social problems because then he'll be too powerful. He'll get this cult of personality, right? So recognize like what the status quo is, right? Like you have to spend all of your money on fighting Pablo Escobar, right? Like you are involved in a war essentially, right? And insofar as this is true, you don't have any money to spend on social services, right? The fact that you no longer have to actually like pay for all these guns and troops and whatever to actually fight Pablo Escobar, you can now spend that money on social services. So the people are going to like you just because of that. So you are going to get more social services. Two, now that there's all this income being generated, you can tax it. That's great. More taxes, more money, more social services, right? So I don't think that's reasonably going to happen, right? So you actually get more social services on our side of the house, right? Moreover, recognize that like the status quo is a complete catastrophe, right? Like you just don't have any social services whatsoever. So anything that is possibly better than that is preferable, right? So we talk about this idea of like a cult of personality, right? So I think what happens is in the status quo, he's going to get this cult of personality anyway because he's been giving lots and lots of money away to people to try and garner goodwill. But at least if you give him this monopoly, then at least he is on your side, right? Like if there is going to be a cult of personality, I'd rather it be someone who's working with the government rather than someone who's fighting the government, right? Like when he draws his cult of personality because he's like just literally giving away billions and billions of dollars, like Colombia is in debt. You don't have any money, but he has the money to pay it off, right? If he can just give this money away, he's gathering lots of people to his cause, right? This is driving people to FARC. This is really, really bad. You don't want to do this. Recognize that by continuing the drug war, you're just costing the Colombian government lots and lots of money. Don't do that, okay? Case side. First thing we tell you is that ending the drug war is essential, right? So then we hear that, like, look, the drug cartels are going to force peace amongst each other, right? And like they won't have to actually fight because they're going to sign these treaties, right? But like, I don't see a reason why this doesn't happen in the status quo, right? Like when there were other drug cartels, they were fighting all the time. There was violence in the streets. But the reason why this stopped was because Pablo Escobar became so powerful and pushed all the other ones out, right? Like the status of monopoly actually suppresses the violence due to drug cartels. This has happened in the past. I think it will happen even more so when you actually give them a state-sanctioned monopoly, right? Next thing here is that the addicted Americans are going to motivate the DEA to, attack you or whatever, fight the drug trade, whatever. So recognize that like the DEA is going to be really mad. Reagan's going to be pretty mad, right? But you still have national sovereignty. Like you can do whatever you want in your country. The U.S. is not going to like it, right? But remember, what Geneva tells you is that the U.S. needs Colombian oil, right? Like there's nothing like, unless America wants to get involved in a foreign war to completely invade and occupy your country, which I just don't think is likely, they're not going to actually do anything about it. Realistically, though, the only thing they can do, since they can't send in more troops because you own the country and they can't do these things, realistically the only thing they're going to do is economic warfare, right? So what does this mean? So this means that they're going to say, well, the Colombian drug trade is really, really powerful because realistically it's the only economic opportunity within the country. So I know maybe we'll create other economic opportunities so people don't flock to the drug cartel, so the drug cartel isn't as profitable, so they aren't as powerful. But what does this mean? This just means more investment from the United States within your country. This is awesome, right? Like, build your infrastructure, build up your country, do all of these things, get the U.S. to do it for you. I think that's fantastic, right? The next thing we hear about is how like taxes and money for social services, right? So recognize that you need some kind of legal system to enforce taxes, right? If you want to collect any taxes, you have to have judges who are willing to prosecute people if they don't pay their taxes. But recognizing the status quo, most of the honest judges are dead. They're just not around anymore. So who is the ones who are enforcing these taxes? Because of the rampant corruption, forced by the Medellin cartel, you just can't enforce any of your tax laws, so you won't be able to gain any tax money. So by partnering up with Pablo Escobar, you now can do this because you can have judges once again operating your country freely. This is awesome. Now you can actually collect your own taxes, right? Also recognize, like in the status quo, I've said this a couple times, like you're spending all your money on the war. Don't do that. Spend it on something productive like social services, end the war, and now you can do that, right? And lastly, remember that like the drug war is just pushing people over to FARC. Like this is really, really bad, right? Like if there is a war and like wow, the government can't do anything, well, I guess we're gonna have to turn to whoever else seems like they can assert a monopoly on power, right? And that drives people to FARC. That drives up violence. Don't do that. So make peace with the cartel. If you can't beat them, join them. That's what we say. For all these reasons, proud to support.
All right, are you guys ready?
Mm-hmm.
So I think the main issue in this round is going to be how do we get long-term solvencies for the issues that are plaguing Colombia? We think the long-term significantly outweighs the short-term because if in the short-term we give all the power to Pablo Escobar, you're not going to have any long-term legitimacy which is necessary in solving the problems that are plaguing Colombia right now. Our advocacy is to take out more debt in the short term to provide for social services ourselves. We think this is better than legitimizing Pablo Escobar, giving him more power, and giving him more free reign to do whatever he wants, and this is inevitably going to lead to an increase in violence because now he is unchecked by any other cartel, and the government has no power to combat him because we're literally slaves to him because he paid off all of our debt. So the first point that we talk about is how epidemics work. And SideGov basically comes up in here says that no new people are going to be entering the cocaine market because of the large price of entry. While this may be true, while the large price of entry may deter some people who are looking into the cocaine, 1980s was a huge crack epidemic. There's a ton of people who are already addicted. Don't let side government play down the effects of cocaine in Colombia. Because the coca plant is so abundant, because there's so many cartels who are introducing cocaine at relatively cheap prices compared to Pablo Escobar, there's a ton of people who are already addicted in America and in Colombia, and raising the price is not going to significantly deter them because of how addiction works. Additionally, we think there's going to be a cultural coercion to start doing cocaine, even if there's a large price of entry. Because cocaine is so prevalent in the culture, because you've now legitimized Pablo Escobar, we think this is bad. So the first thing that, independent point that we had, is how a monopoly is bad and the price spike is bad, because this is going to lead to an increase of crime. So this is inevitably true, right? If you have a monopoly on one industry, you're going to be able to raise the price of one industry, and nobody is going to have a significant check on you to be able to stop this. We think this is actually going to lead to more crime, both in America and in Colombia. And we think both sides are bad, because if there's an increase of rise of crime in America, if more people are selling literally all of their possessions and committing crimes to get these drugs, the American government is going to have significantly more pressure to intervene in Colombia, even if you don't want them to. Additionally, we think having more crime in Colombia is just bad. If people are literally like killing people for their money or selling all their possessions and living on the street or whatever, we think this is going to have more social problems that you're not going to be able to combat because Pablo Escobar now owns the government. So the next thing that they say is Pablo Escobar wants to be popular so that he's not going to go around like shooting people and terrorizing the countryside. This is probably true, but Pablo doesn't unilaterally control his entire organization. If you give Pablo Escobar a monopoly, his organization is going to grow and to be a huge organization in Colombia. This means that even if Pablo wants to maintain the peace and not commit violent acts, people in his organization are inevitably going to commit violent acts because they have the guns, because they have the money, because they have the authority, and Pablo is physically not going to be able to control them because his organization is so big. So this is going to lead to more crime because the people who are in his organization are not going to be bound to the same code of ethics and incentives that Pablo is, and realistically, you just cannot control their actions. So they are going to commit more crimes because you're empowering them and not having a significant check on their safety. Yeah. Oh, so additionally, we think Pablo Escobar is still going to bribe judges and still going to corrupt the legal system to get away with the other crimes that his organization commits. Because, like, if you're suing the drug industry, you cannot just do drugs. Like, there's a lot of methods, like in transporting, like smuggling is still a crime, like killing people is still a crime. We think all those crimes are still going to happen in both worlds, and Pablo Escobar has now more incentive to bribe the judges to get away with more crime. So the second point we talked about is how there's going to be more violence with the deal, and I think I've kind of touched on this already, but let's go over it again. So basically what Gov came up here and said is because Pablo is so powerful, other cartels are going to be deterred and are going to join Pablo instead. We think this is bad for two reasons. So first off, we don't think there's actually going to be deterrence to stop forming any new cartels because the coca plant is so abundant, because cocaine is so relatively easy to an industry to get into because it's so established and people already have the know-how and desire to do so. We don't think that Pablo Escobar having unilateral control of the cocaine industry is actually going to be a meaningful deterrent because people are so desperate. People are going to make bad choices because they think they're going to be the special ones. They think they're going to be able to get away with it. We've seen this. This already happens in the status quo because Pablo is still the Medellin cartel is the most powerful cartel, and yet other cartels still spring up in opposition because they're so desperate, because they will do literally anything to make this money, and cocaine is such an easy industry to get into. So we don't think this is actually going to be a meaningful deterrent. But additionally, we think it's bad even if they are joining Pablo's cartel, which is the alternative that is presented. We think this is bad because they're not going to have Pablo's ethics. They probably are not going to agree that like non-violence is the best way to do business. We think this is going to be an increase of violence because now you're going to have more splinter cells within Pablo's organization, which is going to lead to more infighting, more violence, a worse future for the Colombian people. The third point we talk about is how we should not actually be letting Pablo solve social problems. And government side comes up here and says that any sort of social programs are good. But we don't think in our side of the house that social problems are going to go away entirely. So yeah, maybe we're spending more money right now fighting Pablo Escobar, but we're still providing social services. And if we allow Pablo to take over control over social services, one, we've already told you that these social services are not going to be distributed equally because Pablo is going to favor areas that are going to benefit him eventually. So this is going to lead to more class divide within the country because Pablo is favoring different segments unequally. But additionally, we think this is going to legitimize Pablo further. So any abuses that he tries to get away with later down the line, the people are going to be more permissive. They're going to be more likely to get away with like violent crime. They're going to shelter him or whatever because he's provided these social services. Versus if the government is providing these social services, one, it's going to increase your legitimacy both domestically and in the international sphere. But additionally, this is going to have the long-term solvency because you're going to be able to equally distribute social services throughout the country. So there's going to be like less class divide and more equity. We think this is good. Yeah, okay. Oh, and additionally, we don't want, if Pablo Escobar like pays off the debt and is providing all these social services to people are going to look to him to make decisions instead of the government. You're undermining your own legitimacy, and Pablo is going to be able to control the government because he literally bought your way out of the debt, and you don't want to have like this undue influence over the government. We think this is bad. Switching case side, the first point we talk about is how ending the drug war is going to reduce anarchy. And the government side basically just says that there's a lot of violence in the status quo because all the cartels are infighting, and the status of a monopoly is going to suppress other cartels. So we've already told you why we don't think the other cartels are going to go away, even if you give Pablo Escobar control over the cocaine industry. But additionally, we think this is still really bad. We still think it's going to be really bad if there's other cartels and you give Pablo Escobar control because he's going to be able to commit more violence and there's going to be less checks on him because there's now no incentive to sign a peace treaty with a smaller cartel who is causing problems. They would rather just destroy completely because they don't want this competition, and the government has said that's okay. The next thing that we talk about is how America might be mad. There might be some American backlash, but that doesn't matter because you still have national sovereignty over your own borders, and America is not going to piss off Colombia because they need oil. So we think this is bad to have American backlash, to invite that into your country, because now you're creating an incentive for America to interfere with you more. They need your oil. They don't want your violence. They don't want your drugs. So now America is more likely to send troops against you, to impose sanctions on you in other areas, to trap your people in America, not let them return home, to do basically anything because you now back them into a corner because of the rise of violence and because they still, we don't really do questions over Google Rounds. Sorry, that's really confusing. We were creating an incentive for America to back into a corner. And now, of course, America is going to react badly because they're literally so desperate to do anything they possibly can to stop this influx of drugs, to stop to continue with the oil. We think this is going to be a worse incentive for America to react against you badly. But additionally, if you don't want the DEA in your country, you have to show the American government that you're capable of dealing with the drug war by yourself. So if you're okaying Pablo Escobar, if you're okaying the flow of Colombian cocaine into America, America is more likely to send in their DEA agents because the Colombian government is literally telling them that they are not capable of stopping the drug war themselves. So the next thing we talk about is how we're not going to be an effective legal system because there's no honest judges and they're all dead. We think there's going to be corrupt judges on both sides of the house. It's better to not have less violence. So the second and third points is about Colombian stability and Escobar's drug monopoly is good for the economy. I think we've already kind of talked about this because I'm running out of time. So let's talk about Colombian political stability. We think giving Pablo Escobar the legitimacy he needs to enact these social programs and to have a lot of power over the government is going to result in reduced Colombian political stability in the long term because the government is giving up its authority, it's giving its a seal of approval to a violent drug dealer who is literally killing Colombian people. We think this is going to be bad for long-term political solvency. We think that's bad. Proud to oppose.
There are two clear frameworks one could use to evaluate the round. The first is who best solves the problem of drug violence in Colombia, and the second is who best gets a better economic outcome for the government and its people. We'll win on both of these frameworks. The first, violence. What we told you is that when there are multiple cartels, it's much more likely that land will be divided up to ultimately sue for peace and ultimately have less violence spilling out into the streets. The response we got was Pablo Escobar will crush everyone who ultimately wants to join. What Lonnie, I think, did a phenomenal job explaining was that when people don't have any, well, Lonnie, I think, did a phenomenal job explaining is that you have a constant incentive for people to ultimately fight because they want to get a piece of the drug market. What I said in LOC that I don't think was adequately responded to is that there was a huge incentive to use a minimal amount of violence because if you get any piece of the drug market at all, you're now able to undercut the cartel. The reason why cartels like OPEC implode every few years is because the problem with the cartel is that if any one person simply does not agree and is able to undercut it by offering a lower price, they're able to completely eradicate any kind of monopoly the cartel has, meaning there's a huge incentive for people to buy for that person. This is why there is a huge incentive for literally every person, either outside and inside the organization, to try and undercut the cartel to offer a lower price to undercut side gov's monopoly. Meaning there is a huge incentive for people to try and enter violence. Meaning even if you believe that Pablo Escobar is ultimately able to crush the violence, because there is a huge incentive for these lower people to keep committing violence, that just means he has to constantly crush violence, which means it's much more likely that violence will then spill onto the streets and we think it's bad. There is no incentive for, say, a small group to ultimately sue for peace, because we know that they don't have a larger organization whose reputation they're risking. They're simply throwing whatever they can to get a huge percentage of the pie, which they have a huge incentive to do so, because if they're able to get anything at all, they can undercut the cartel and get a huge amount of violence. That is why you get more drug violence on that side of the house. You add to that the fact that you literally legitimize the cartels, making it more likely people see these as reasonable people, makes it more likely violence will occur. It is true that Pablo Escobar does not desire violence, like it is not his end goal to ultimately have violence. When you increase the incentive of everyone else to commit violence because they know they can now undercut a cartel easily, we think it increases his actual need for violence more than simply having another cartel which is able to sit down and negotiate with. That's why they get more violence in that side of the house. But the second framework that I think is important, and the one that I think is probably outweighs everything, is who gets a better economic outcome for Colombia in the long term. So our advocacy throughout this entire round has been that a little debt is fine. In fact, we're fine taking out more of it, ultimately pay for social services yourself. We think this is an adequate and, in fact, a more substantial solution to the problems in Colombia because it increases the legitimacy of the government as a whole. The reason why Pablo Escobar ultimately does well in the country is because people see him providing social services and see the government failing to provide social services. That when you are a poor person in Colombia trying to feed a family and put a winter coat onto your children, when Pablo Escobar is willing to provide that money and the government is not, it simply makes sense to oppose the government. There was no long-term solution from them about how they ever reverse this narrative. All they said is, well, you can ultimately create a better class and then use the tax money. The argument that I said that was completely damning is that these people have no incentive to provide taxes to the government, to be okay with tax increases, because they're not getting social services from the government, they're getting it from Pablo Escobar and the drug cartels. What is the meaningful point from side gov about why these people would ever consent to paying higher taxes to pay off the debt? You simply did not get one. When it is the drug cartels providing the social services, the education, and the food for their family, they have no incentive to ultimately consent into meaningful government. We also said that when Pablo Escobar provides social services, it's going to be very biased to the sectors that he ultimately provides for. Like the argument that Geneva gave, that the cartels might be more effective in providing social service than the government, I completely annihilated when I said Pablo Escobar ultimately has a greater incentive to ultimately help the sectors that benefits him rather than sectors that provide competing interests in the country, such as things like the business sector and the manufacturing sector. Meaning these other sectors never get started. Meaning if it's true that Colombia has a huge oil sector, we simply said it's good to have other sectors developed so you don't have one sector literally running the economy. We said Pablo Escobar, even if he's good at distributing social services, there'll be welfare services that ultimately do not build up other sectors of the economy the same way the government can by subsidizing other industries to exist in the long term. Meaning you have less tax revenue when people don't consent, and you ultimately have less sectors building up the economy as a whole, which you think is bad. The final thing I want to collapse on is that when price increases to people that are already addicted because there's a crack epidemic in the 80s, it ultimately means the U.S. has a greater incentive to invade. In the end, it's simple. People turn towards the FARC, and they turn toward Pablo Escobar when two things happen. When the government does not provide social services, and when the U.S. intervenes. SideGov increases both experiences because SideGov continues to not provide social services, and the U.S. has an added incentive to intervene when price increases, meaning people are more likely to commit crimes on the streets of Chicago to get the drugs they're already addicted to. Proud to oppose.
Here, here. Everyone ready? Alright. So I want to set up the very clear comparative between the status quo and what we are proposing here. In the status quo, Pablo Escobar is the only one providing social services, and I explained why this is. Because when the government has to spend all of its money fighting the drug war in the streets, fighting a drug war that it will never win, all that means is more and more of a black hole where you are spending more money on that and cannot provide these social services to your people. So all the harms that they talk about Pablo Escobar being the only one providing social services are ones that are happening in the status quo, delegitimizing the Colombian government, driving people towards the FARC, and ultimately prompting U.S. intervention, because while the U.S. will not intervene because of the drug trade, it will intervene if your government collapses and the FARC is the one that comes to power, which only happens on their side of the house. What we tell you is that in the status quo, people are dying in the street because of the drug trade, because Pablo Escobar is trying to set it up as though the Colombian government is leading to the deaths of these people. If the Colombian government would just stop fighting the drug war, people would stop dying. So he has incentive to continue this war for as long as you are fighting him. But at the point at which you give Pablo Escobar this monopoly, at the point at which you stop fighting back against him, people stop dying in the street. Insofar as we think that as the Colombian government, your primary obligation is to protect the lives of your own citizens, you need to do whatever you can right now to stop this violence. Side opposition talks about how you need to retain your sovereignty. Right? I think that we are the only ones that maintain Colombian sovereignty for a couple of reasons. We think that regardless of whether you buy any of their arguments about how drug crime is going to go up in the United States and the United States is going to invade, we think that that's almost certainly not a likelihood. We've given you two reasons why that's not true. First of all, we tell you that the United States will not possibly invade in Colombia because of the oil interest, because the United States needs to continue to have that Colombian oil supplied to the United States, and because they've tried to fight a jungle war before and they have not succeeded. Second of all, because the United States knows that the only alternative to the current Colombian government is the FARC communist regime. And as we've seen empirically, the United States is willing to let countries get away with a lot of shit, like, say, the drug trade, if it means that they're propping up a capitalist government and not a communist government. So insofar as that's true, the United States has no reason to intervene. The United States will respect your sovereignty in this case. So first question, how do we protect Colombian citizens from violence? We tell you the monopoly is safer from competition. And the argument they give you is no, it's safer to have gangs come to these peace agreements with each other. But that's not how gangs work. Gangs are constantly in competition with each other and will cause violence and bloodshed on the streets of Colombia. Jeff talks to you about economies of scale, which is the reason why other gangs can't break into Pablo Escobar's market. But even if you buy it, they can. I think it's much easier for the government to stamp out the small drug enterprises than it is to try to stamp out Pablo Escobar and all those small enterprises that will arise, which I don't actually think is possible. Right? I think it's much better to have them not all it's not much better to have all the drug trade not at each other's throats. And I think that they drop another argument that we make, that cross pressures from rivaling gangs, which is the only alternative to giving Pablo Escobar a monopoly, would drop the price of the drugs, which would get more Colombians more addicted to cocaine. And given that we think that addiction is a bad thing in the long, we think that addiction is a bad thing, I think that's not something that we want to do. I think the Pablo Escobar's monopoly is much safer than competition. I think with competition, all you have is violence. They talk about incentives to break into the status quo, but I actually think that Pablo Escobar's empire provides a lot of opportunities for people to get involved in the drug trade and make a lot of money. And they talk about how, like, you know, people in the lower levels of this organization are just going to commit violence. Like, no, that's not how, like, an organization like this works. It's, like, extremely efficient. Pablo Escobar is just going to, like, keep people from being able to commit this violence, especially because, as we tell you, he wants to look like the good guy to the Colombian people, so he has an incentive to not let people at the lower level of his empire, like, you know, be killing people in the streets and things like that. He can control the organization himself, and people in his organization have the same incentives to, like, keep themselves popular to the Colombian people. So then they talk about how it's better to take out more debt in the short term to provide social services. We tell you this is a black hole because you still have to spend all that money on defense. You still have this war in the streets against Pablo Escobar. We tell you that, like, when you stop fighting this war in the streets, you have more money to spend on things like anti-addiction campaigns. And then, given that Pablo Escobar is already providing all the social services in the status quo, at worst, you only increase your own legitimacy by providing more social services by taking money away from what you're spending on defense. Third question is, how do we restore the legitimacy of the Colombian government? We tell you first, you need a functioning legal system. In the status quo, you have no functioning government because Pablo Escobar is just killing all the honest politicians and judges. I think this has gone pretty much cold drop. The only way to like let a government exist is to stop going after him. Nothing that destroys legitimacy more than no government, which is the only alternative. We tell you that Escobar doesn't have an incentive to commit other crimes because he wants to get the hearts and minds of the Colombian people. And, like, they tell you, like, oh, but there's going to be other things they're going to do, like smuggling. Like, recognize, like, if we legalize the drug trade, like, smuggling is probably not illegal. We tell you that the government provides more social services, it increases its legitimacy, and we tell you when it has less debt, it also has, like, a greater ability to provide those. Given that they've given you the warning that social services are key to government legitimacy, if we can provide more, I think we've clearly won the round. But they drop the most devastating argument that we give you so far. We tell you that if you don't take the deal, the people are going to see that the government doesn't care about protecting them. They're going to turn to the FARC, rebel against your government, invite American intervention, and then you're not going to have your own government or Colombia anymore. For all those reasons, we're very proud to propose. Sweet, nice round, guys.
Cool.
Yeah, this is a cool case.
Thanks. Yeah, if you guys have any, like, comments or anything like that, that would be, we'd appreciate that.
What is the status quo since Pablo Escobar has been in Panama?
Yeah.
Is he? So you said he is still he's still an active participant in drug trade in Colombia. Does he have any kind of monopoly, or is he weaker since having left?
So he doesn't have, like, a de facto monopoly, or he does have, like, a de facto monopoly, but he doesn't have, like, a de jure monopoly, right? So, like, he has most control over the drug trade. It's mostly consolidated under him. His, like, cronies are running it while he's out of the country.
So is there very little in the status quo? Is there very little violence